In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right, Sublation people, Sublators, we had some trouble here before. Maybe you can leave a comment if you did manage to see the stream when we first launched it. But it is, of course, the day of days, Monday, when we usually do the Sublation Magazine stream. But I saw on Twitter that there was some trouble with StreamYard, and we appeared to be one of the people who faced that trouble. We didn't reach YouTube. Not sure where the stream went. But it seems like people are watching now. So anyhow, I'll just introduce the topic again. Trump versus Elon. Also, the prospects for nuclear escalation in Russia and the last election. I'm Doug Lain, head honcho here. This is Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, you want to introduce yourself again?
Benjamin Studebaker, PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge, author of 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
All right, so I'm going to stop panicking. It seems like it is working now. And I'm going to say that along with discussing these current events, which could be cataclysmic, I mean, if Elon gets mad, who knows what he'll do. But I also want to look back on the last election. I just recently finished a screening cut, a cut that we're going to actually screen of the documentary in New York at NYU on the 20th. It runs from 5 to 8. There will be more announcements as to just exactly where that will be at NYU. But we welcome everyone in New York who's watching to show up and see the entire documentary. I want to run a clip from the documentary. Ben, I did this before on the stream that didn't go out. Was it too quiet, do you think? Or how did it sound?
It sounded okay to me.
Okay, good. All right, then I will run it the same way. And here is the last election at the trailer. It seems like every U.S. election has been billed as the most important one in the country's history. The claim always seems phony. Trotted out every 4 years. Here we go. The whole charade is going to happen again. But in 2024, the claim was different. Both candidates didn't just say that it was the most important election, but rather they both said that it was potentially the last election we'd ever have if things went wrong. And yet there is a group of young Americans who still love politics as a kind of self-expression. And I went with some of them, a crew of Zoomers and Millennials, to the RNC and the DNC to make this film. They worked both in front of and behind the cameras and equipment. Some of them are on the screen now.
I'm a congressman back home in Portugal, and we're here to be inspired in this historic moment where you're about to elect a woman of color.
It's a different feeling. Like today was really positive, and it was a vibe. It was just really exciting out there today.
What kind of change would you characterize Harris as representing?
Women.
It's been really dynamic. A lot of diversity, a lot of enthusiasm, energy, vibe. It's great.
What kind of change does the transition from a Biden to a Harris candidacy represent?
Well, it represents very great joy and happiness.
And the energy is pretty electric. It's something that we saw back in Denver when Obama was the nominee. So it's really reminiscent of that. So it's good to see lots of people sort of walking around with smiles on their face and pep in their step.
Yeah, I definitely think that Kamala would not be a lot of people's first choice. Certainly it would not have been my first choice, and I think in another election I might not be voting for her.
So for people who are discontented with the Democrats, what options are there politically?
None. Benjamin and I went to Chicago and Milwaukee for the DNC and the RNC. to film there to create this documentary film, which right now I'm thinking we might title it The Last Election. What do you think about that title? I've been kicking around titles. What do you think of that one?
People will think that you actually think that, and then when it's not the last election, it will diminish the credibility of the film.
Dang. All right. So, I mean, I threw that trailer together this morning. The audio in parts is the music is too loud. I recognize that. I'm going to fiddle around with it more so we can, have it be a little bit better so people will go and see the screening. But yeah, that captures just some of the spirit of what came out of the documentary. I don't think you've seen the screening cut yet, have you, Benjamin?
No, I have not seen the full-length final cut.
Okay, I have a secret hidden away link I will send you after this, and you can take a look before New York. But I guess before we jump into today's topic, just what do you recollect about making the film and about the last election?
Oh, well, it was so evocative. We went to these two different conventions in two very different cities, laid out very differently, and had completely different experiences. Insofar as the two parties are the same, you would expect to have similar experiences, but it was striking how, as a cultural event, they were very different.
Yeah, they totally different. What would you say the primary difference was from your estimation?
The primary difference was that the Republican convention was full of people who struck me as foolish because they were hopeful, and the Democratic convention struck me as full of people who were foolish because they were scared.
Yeah, right. That I wouldn't be quite as cynical about it as in terms of the RNC, but that you're right. The people, first of all, they were different kinds of people. The people we managed to talk to at the DNC were all, it seemed to me, and I wasn't there for all the interviews, but just going through the footage, it seemed to me they were very much scripted or vetted in some way for the most part. Even if they hadn't been officially given the task of being a media person, they
were self-vetting. They were worried that they were going to say something that would hurt Harris in some way all the time.
Right. Yeah. Whereas at the RNC, people were just there for whatever reason. They all had their own different reasons, and they were not concerned about what they might say nearly as much. And they were just a different kind of person. There was more there was a more rough and tumble feeling to the streets around Republican conventions. There was much more going on.
An undisciplined enthusiasm, which synergized with Milwaukee and Milwaukee's drinking culture.
Right. That's right. Right. Where, yeah, the DNC didn't have that. We did go to a bar and, near the convention but it didn't feel the same in that.
The bar. People in the bar in Chicago were very clearly people who had wandered from some establishment place. It seemed like an after-work event from 50 years ago.
Right. Yeah, so yeah, it was just much more professionalized at the DNC, but at the same time, much hollower. Just less was going on culturally, I guess, and politically, maybe not much was going on either place. But
that is, I think, the culture of the Democratic Party is much more professional.
Mm-hmm.
And the voter base is much more university educated. It reflects things that are, I think, fundamentally true about that party and where it is.
Right. So, I mean, that's one of the things that comes out from the documentary. I hope that there's more to learn from it than just that. A good section of the film focuses on the protests at the DNC, and then of course sort of reflections through each one of the participants, as then reflected through me. So, I'm excited about the film coming out. I hope that it can be of some use for people who are trying to make sense of this political moment. And what I wonder now is if you what do you make of this political moment? I guess starting with Elon and Trump, in light of kind of the promise of the Trump campaign as we experienced it in Milwaukee.
Yeah, I figured that at some point the Trump administration would move on from Elon, and that it might be acrimonious. There might be a certain amount of conflict. I thought that it might happen after they pass some version of the tax cuts. Mm-hmm. If there were negative consequences associated with the tax cuts and the various other spending cuts that get packaged with them, or if there was discontent around the trade war, one of the things that the administration might do is find an unpopular person and kind of stick the blame on them, fire them. And if it's a billionaire like Musk, getting rid of him can seem anti-establishment because it can seem like an act of independence from billionaire wealth. And the favorability numbers for Musk trail everybody else in the Trump administration by roughly 10 points. So he is the obvious kind of fall guy if things aren't going so well. The fact that it got to this point before they'd managed to pass some version of the tax cut, whether it's the bill coming out of the House, the big, beautiful bill, or a set of different smaller bills coming out of the Senate, that to me is a sign of weakness, that they had to have this fight now before they've even gotten the legislation through, that they have to have it more than a full year before the midterm elections.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sign that there is significant internal tension, and this internal tension may continue to be a problem going forward. Now they're having to fight because Musk thinks that by coming out against this bill, he can kill it. It's in that vulnerable a spot that Musk thinks that he can oppose it effectively.
Yeah. Do you think that Musk is reliable in terms of his political calculations? How much should we take out of that, really? Because he does always strike me as a bit unstable, erratic, even more than Trump.
Yeah, I think Musk is a quite foolish person with very limited, in terms of politics. He has other skills, but in terms of as a political actor, I think he is not very good. And we saw that in the Twitter back and forth, where he throws out this claim about the Epstein files, and then immediately Epstein's lawyer says there's nothing in the Epstein files which would cause trouble to Trump, and then Musk deletes the tweet. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats are immediately trying to win Musk back and championing whatever it is that Musk says, which I think is striking because Musk is making the case that the bill doesn't have enough cuts. Part of why it doesn't have enough cuts is that Musk didn't find enough cuts. But also, in making the case that there aren't enough cuts, this is a bill which already includes work requirements for Medicaid that are projected to kick roughly 11 million people off the Medicaid rolls. And the Democrats are trying to court the guy who says that there aren't enough cuts in the bill.
How many people are on Medicaid right now? You know?
Oh, I couldn't tell you the exact number off the top of my head.
But is 11 million a significant percentage of the number of people who are on Medicaid? I mean, I know it's a lot of people, but
it's a significant chunk.
Yeah. And that work requirement is in the legislation that's being debated now. Do you think it will be part of the big, beautiful bill in the end, or how is that?
Well,
what are its chances?
It is part of that bill at this time. I don't know ultimately if it will make it through the Senate. I thought that there would be more mobilization around this issue. In the first Trump administration, when there was talk about removing millions and millions of people from healthcare roles, this was something that became very central for a while in 2017 in the discussion. And that hasn't really happened this time. Maybe it's in part because we're talking about people on Medicaid rather than people on the Obamacare markets. but there seems to be a profound lack of interest in the fate of these 11 million people from everybody, from the Democrats to the left to the Republicans. Nobody seems to care about them at all. And the public discussion has become focused on immigration and the police and Greta Thunberg and Gaza and even the military parade. There's just a profound lack of interest in this.
Matt Gilbert says, it's funny how they only care about the national debt when social spending is a question. Of course, the national debt is nothing to worry about. My understanding is that the national debt is largely due to maybe a combination of things. But it is largely down to the amount of social spending that we do. Even if you were to cut the military budget substantially, it wouldn't address the national debt as quickly as social spending cuts could. The other factor, of course, is the tax rate, that is low or being cut. So that also creates the debt. But is it the case that people aren't really concerned about the national debt in either party?
I think that there is some level of concern about the size of the interest payments as a percentage of government spending. But that isn't just reducible to the debt in nominal terms. It's also a question about economic growth. So if they believe that they're going to generate a substantial amount of economic growth, then even if they increase the debt in nominal terms or in real terms, they might nonetheless think that it will remain manageable relative to the size of the economy, that the interest payments will remain manageable relative to the size of the economy. That's really what they're calculating. So a lot of the debate is about whether there's going to be growth as a consequence of the policy and whether that growth will offset any increase in the debt in terms of the government's fiscal position going forward.
Yeah, that's certainly always the argument around tax cuts, right? The tax cuts are aimed at increasing the growth of GDP, which then would offset the shortfall, the debt. Do you think that there's some truth to that idea?
Well, insofar as you get growth. But of course, whether you get growth is not just a consequence of the tax policy, but also a consequence of so many other things that are going on, many of which you don't control and are contingent. So it's there's also a tendency to try to kill social programs by cutting taxes on the promise of economic growth. And then if that growth doesn't arrive, then you have an excuse to potentially cut the social programs as an alternative to raising taxes. And that is what's happening here. There wasn't enough growth out of the first Trump tax cuts to produce a situation where the budget looks decent now. So because there wasn't enough growth over the last 8 years, they are now in a situation where they are looking to cut programs so as to make the tax cuts look more defensible today.
Well, is it a matter of making the tax cuts look defensible, or is it a matter of doing what's necessary after the COVID crisis and crash to get the growth back up where it needs to be?
Well, most of the COVID stuff the COVID spending is already off the books at this point.
I'm not talking about the spending, but I'm talking about the hit to the overall economy that we took from COVID shutdowns and supply chain problems and the overall depression of not a literal economic depression, but the suppression of the global economy and the U.S. economy that came from COVID. So,
well, there's a question about whether this tax policy is going to generate a large amount of growth. Right. The last time that they did it, it generated some growth, but not enough to prevent them from being in a situation where they now have this question about how to fund the tax cut going forward.
Right. But my point again is the factor that intervened after the tax cut was the major shock to the global economy that came from COVID. So it
Yeah,
wouldn't be
but
as
at this
though,
point, US GDP growth is relatively competitive in terms of the rate with the pre-COVID level. It's not as if US GDP growth is today at European levels. The Europeans have almost no growth at all. The United States, in the Biden administration, the GDP grew at the kind of post-2008 rate that has become normal, the 2 to 3% kind of rate that has become typical in recent years. The claim that people who are champions of, really changing the tax policy make is that it's possible with the right kind of fiscal policy to have 4 or 5% GDP growth again, which I don't know if that's true. We haven't seen that. There have been a number of these tax cuts dating back to the Bush administration tax cut in the early 2000s. They have not tended to produce 4 or 5% GDP growth with any kind of regularity. So
right, but isn't there another piece of the puzzle now as well, which would be these tariffs and the attempt to force some more onshoring to also grow the U.S. economy through production and rearranging trade deals, not entirely supplanting other parts of the world in terms of production, but to increase the amount of exports from the United States and local production in order to grow our economy, and then the tax cuts would just be part of the incentive to create that increased production.
Well, rearranging where production occurs around the world doesn't increase the size of the world economy. It creates adjustment costs during the period where you're moving stuff from place to place. And it's not clear that the trade policy is going to reshore a very large number of jobs to the United States. It may do this in certain sectors relevant to national defense. But I still think what's most likely is that insofar as jobs move, they move from China to other states with relatively similar labor market conditions as China. States like the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, maybe even. I'm not really expecting there to be some huge movement of manufacturing from China to the United States. And even if something like that happened, it would be very disruptive, and it would lead to supply chain issues and potential reductions in the near term in purchasing. And a reduction in consumption would have constricting effects for the global economy. So on the one hand, they have this policy that's meant to kick up global growth rates. On the other hand, they're engaged in a trade war, which is meant to rearrange the way stuff is produced with significant adjustment costs. Really, I think that the tax cut is a way to try to make the trade policy more sustainable by offsetting to some degree the disruption that the trade policy causes by increasing the amount of investment available to speed up the process of moving things around. That's what they're thinking. But they're trying to fight to defend a tax cut that they already made. So they're really fighting to extend a tax cut that has already been on the books. This tax cut was in operation for the last 8 years. It's not like it's going to open up a lot of new possibility.
I'm just trying to think through their side of the argument here, for devil's advocate position here.
Well, that's why they say that the baseline in the CBO report is wrong, because the baseline treats the tax cut as if it were a new thing, as opposed to already part of the baseline. So that's why in the CBO report, it claims that the policy dramatically increases the debt and the deficit because it treats the tax cut as if it were a new item, as if it were assumed that the tax cut would not continue, as opposed to assuming that it would.
Yeah, but regardless of whether or not it's a continuation of the tax cut from before or new, the reason to advocate for it is not in an effort to increase global growth, but specifically to increase U.S. growth, and so that we can get out from under both the trade deficit and a national deficit, which are different things, but which relate to each other. And so if you don't think about this in terms of trying to increase the growth of global capital evenly, or maybe not increase the growth of global capital at all, but rather think of it in terms of and trying to increase the growth of U.S. capital in an effort to maintain power over the globe, then the argument would be we increase it, or we continue the tax cuts and try to rearrange the trade agreements and encourage onshoring on the basis of tax cuts and other incentives, including tariffs on the one hand and other direct
because
spending
these tax
incentives.
cuts were operating during the Biden administration, with the exception of the trade war. This was what the Biden administration was doing. It was retaining the Trump tax cuts and trying to subsidize or encourage reshoring of industries, especially related to defense, to the United States. The thing that Trump adds into the mix is the trade war, such as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, he is trying to make the tax cuts more fiscally sustainable by introducing a bunch of spending cuts. The fact that they feel that they need to do the spending cuts is indicative of a belief that they're not going to produce so much growth that the spending cuts are unnecessary.
True. That's true. And I agree with that last claim, that seems true enough. But yeah, but they are framing it as in terms of cutting waste, fraud, and abuse and all of that kind of thing.
Of course, that's the framing. But then what do you actually see here? Work requirements for Medicaid.
Right.
People with kids over the age of 6 having to go to work to get Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
People who are in their 60s having to go to work to get Medicaid, in their early 60s now. Yeah.
Right.
Not waste. Taking benefits away from people who really don't have very much. That's what they, of course, have to resort to, because Musk was not able to find a bunch of obviously popular cuts. Now, there are some additional tax breaks included, like the no taxes on tips thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's intended to make it more popular with labor. So, hey, if you work for tips, you should support this, because who cares about the Medicaid people? They're not working alongside you for tips. So there's an attempt to make a cut there and to treat the people who are being negatively affected by the bill as scroungers, as people who don't work and therefore don't have a right to things like health care.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about waste, fraud, and abuse because it was not only a claim from Trump, but also from the Government Accountability Office under Biden, that there was between $233 billion to $521 billion loss per year to fraud. According
in which
to
program?
Let's see, across the federal government.
Well,
so
people can make these kinds of big claims, but to actually find specific stuff that you can actually politically cut, that when you try to cut it, people will ultimately back and support the cut, that's a much more difficult thing in practice to do. Musk tried to find a bunch of specific cuts, take them to department heads who in principle were also committed to cutting spending and wanted to shrink the size of their departments and felt that many of the people in their departments were their political adversaries. Nevertheless, the amount that they were able to find was not very large. Now Musk says it's because he was obstructed in trying to cut the size of the government. But he was a supporter of the bill until he left the administration, and a bunch of news stories came out about Republicans in the Senate and in the House saying horrible, nasty things about him to journalists under the shield of anonymity. Loads and loads of these reports.
Regardless of how DOGE was run, the Government Accountability Office found $233 billion to $521 billion per year in fraud, according to their account. That's what they found in 2022. Of that, a good portion of it was having to do with pandemic relief. So
which is all off the books already.
Right.
That stuff is all long gone and dead and old. Has nothing to do with the current budget.
Right. But still, $233 billion to $521 billion per year across the government, according to the
There was tons of PPP fraud, all of that. That's old.
Still, I'm just going to get through the thought. Even if we understand that it will not be anywhere near as many dollars now, without the pandemic relief being a portion of the fraud, a good portion of the fraud, most of it maybe. If we say that there's 100 billion a year in fraud, and we use the government accountability office's findings for that kind of guesstimate, then that alone could get us to the 800 billion.
Why didn't they find that then? He had one job, which was to find that stuff, call it out. Ostensibly, the president and everybody in the administration was committed to finding that stuff and getting rid of it. And he couldn't do it.
I think the reason why he couldn't do it is because the fraud that they're talking about is not a matter of programs that are fraudulent, or it wasn't a matter of targeting particular heads, but rather it had to do with the way in which filing was done. So a good portion of what would be called fraud, according to the Government Accountability Office, was actually misfiling, which if you would operate under the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, would have probably gone through regardless. So, but
again, that's all to do with the pandemic. During the pandemic, there were a bunch of these programs hastily thrown together with very limited barriers for getting the money. So you could very easily get things like unemployment benefit, things like which was increased in size. So if you were getting unemployment benefit when you shouldn't have been getting it during the pandemic, the amount in dollars that counts for in terms of government waste or government fraud is larger. And the same goes for the PPP loans. And because these programs were very hastily rolled out and their goal was to inject lots of cash into the economy, they did not try to make the programs very difficult to get access to. If anything, they made it too easy to get access to these programs, right? Because they were bent on trying to inject a ton of money into the economy as quickly as humanly possible. They didn't want any barriers to it. And they knew that there was going to be some fraud and waste, but that fraud and waste would still inject money into the economy at a point at which it was desperately needed. So it was still functional during that situation.
Right. Okay. But it just, I guess it does seem to me that if the Government Accountability Office is finding such a significant amount of fraud, admittedly, again, during the pandemic, that fraud, what we are calling fraud, and this is a key point, that what's called fraud may be an inadequate implementation of bureaucratic red tape to constrain or suppress the number of people who would really legitimately be making claims. So that's like built into these institutions to begin with, is you make it very difficult. You create the possibility to deny claims on technocratic or pedantic grounds. And then, so that effort to limit claims isn't functioning well enough, according to the Government Accountability Office, is the main thing that I
it can also be expensive to means test. So sometimes you lose a substantial amount of the money you try to save by preventing people from getting access to a benefit program. And in those cases, you seem to have a greater level of efficiency if you allow a certain amount of waste to occur. Of course, if it becomes widely known that there's an exploit in the system, then you reach a stage at which it does become cost effective to close up a hole like that. But Musk was making claims that were definitively not true about the Social Security program. He was claiming that waste existed in places where it is proven not to exist and known not to exist. He was claiming that dead people were getting Social Security payments. He was saying all kinds of cockamamie stuff that has no basis in reality. And then, ultimately, when he was given the task of finding the cuts to produce public support for this bill, he could not find enough cuts, not only to convince the public to support the bill, but to convince himself to support the bill ultimately. Now, I do think that his turning on the administration is motivated in large part by pettiness and hurt feelings, to do with the way that everybody in the Republican Party seemingly has been trashing him to the press. These stories that have come out about Republicans describing him as this huge political liability and somebody they want nowhere near their campaigns. I think all of that has really aggravated him because it seems to him to be a kind of ingratitude. And then he is now attempting to prevent the legislation from passing, which was the whole purpose of his activity. The whole purpose of his activity was to generate support for this legislation. So now not only has he failed to do the stuff that he said he was going to do, he is now attempting to prevent the legislation from passing by intervening in public discourse to damage it and suggesting that he'll donate money potentially to independents and courting the Democrats in public in a bid to try to get the Republicans in the Senate to stop this. So this is a level of infighting that I think exceeds what most of us who expected there to be some kind of infighting would have projected. It's earlier than we would have projected. It's more intense than we would have projected. And it's at a stage in the political process and political time that is earlier than is really functional for the administration. Fighting with Musk could have been functional for the administration after the bill is passed, when lots of people are angry about the Medicaid cuts. He could have attempted to blame Musk for all of it and say, he told me that it wouldn't cause all of this. He said that it wouldn't have all of these effects. I didn't know. I listened to him. I thought he was a smart guy. There could have been some kind of process of distancing that then, if you had a bunch of Democratic ads that were all focused around Musk, could have made those ads a big waste of money. But instead, by having this fight now before the bill is even passed, with Musk actively plotting with the senators to try to kill the bill, we have a level of infighting that is quite significant at a quite early stage.
Why do you think it is that Musk couldn't find ways to make the cuts that would at least create the political impression that he was going for? If not, because, you know, there have been previous attempts to root out areas for cuts and suggestions made that, if you just read the suggestions, would seem to indicate that it would be possible to reach 800 billion within 10 years without any substantive cuts to these programs based on waste and fraud alone, according to the GAO. So I'm wondering what it is that makes both.
You keep raising this study that's based on the COVID data. It's really,
it's not all based on the COVID data. It's not all
from the COVID period. It's from a fiscal year. You said it was.
That original 233 billion to 500 billion, yeah, that is based on the COVID data. But there's lots of it that I've looked at before, and it seems to me that 100 billion, I'm not saying it literally is the case, but I'm just saying according to previous regimes, this amount is actually within spitting distance, just based on a combination of, let's say, Medicaid and Social Security waste.
Well, that is not true. Medicaid and Social Security waste is not going to provide you with hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts to federal spending. That's just not true.
Over 10 years, we're talking about.
Well, if it's over 10 years, if you're talking about finding $100 billion over 10 years, you have an infinitesimal amount of money from the point of view of the federal budget that's completely inconsequential and wouldn't go any distance to funding your tax.
No, well, it would be about 100. What we're talking about is 100 billion a year, not 100 billion over 10 years, but not 800 billion all at once or 500 billion all at once, but 62 billion. Oh, wait, hold on. All right, I'm backing off. It was 62 million that I saw, not 62.
Oh, geez, million orders of magnitude.
Yeah,
that's an incredible difference.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they are not likely to find what they're looking for. The thing is, a lot of the money that's spent, even if it might look like waste or fraud from certain points of view, often still does have a function politically.
Okay.
Even if it seems unnecessary to somebody, it will have a function politically. So if you try to cut it, there will be some sort of political push. And whether that political push is justified, unjustified, depends on what you care about, what you value, who you are. But in practice, the reason that it's very difficult to cut federal spending is that a lot of the federal money matters to significant constituencies. So if it matters to somebody, there's an argument that it's not waste or fraud because somebody cares that the money gets spent, somebody who has enough power to potentially protect the spending.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody is getting satisfied with it who matters enough that they can kick up a fuss in the event that you try to take it away. So there's a political aspect to calling something waste or fraud, which is in part motivated by a desire to get rid of it. You have to be able to argue and litigate what counts as waste or fraud. The issue with Musk is that he was totally undisciplined in his messaging. So he would highlight, stuff that would sound very obviously like waste or fraud to people, but then the amount of money would be too small. Mm-hmm. And then he would try to claim that there was a bunch of other money out there in programs like Social Security, where that isn't the case, and where that program is of great concern to people. So when he would suggest that he thought there was loads of money to cut in Social Security, the message that sends is that this is a guy who's willing to cut programs that matter to you. And he's willing to be very undisciplined in the claims that he makes about these programs.
Mm-hmm.
So can you trust him? And that,
right.
I think, is why his favorability numbers dropped to 10 points below everybody else in the administration.
Yeah, no, we went over that at the time. I mean, I didn't take as deep a dive into all of his claims as I expected, but it was also very difficult to get very deep with the kinds of claims that he was making because he was doing it on Twitter. And I'm not trying to in any way defend Trump or Elon's approach to finding waste and fraud. And I'm not even trying to claim that there is necessarily enough waste and fraud out there to actually get us to the goal. But it does strike me as, and I know I'm probably just making too big a deal out of this thing because of the pandemic, but it did strike me as worth noting that this is not the first time around for these kinds of claims to be made in an effort to get down the deficit. And what I'm just wondering is, do you believe that these programs are being run basically efficiently? Like that there, or is it the case that there's a significant amount of bloat that just can't be dealt with or can't be undone because it's very difficult to weed out what is actual bloat and actual overspending and what is not?
It's very difficult to try to sort through what would count as bloat or as waste. It's a political question what counts as bloat or as waste in the first place. I think that there are reasons why many people have tried to cut government spending or government waste. This has happened many times over the course of the last 30, 40 years because there have been repeated efforts to cut taxes and then to make those tax cuts work fiscally. Mm-hmm. So I think many, many people have tried. And part of what we're seeing now is a kind of exhaustion with this, where governments are getting to a stage where they really struggle to cut very much more. There was a discussion of this when Keir Starmer came in the UK, and he asked the civil servants, okay, what can we cut? And the civil servants said to him, this has already been done so many times, there's nothing left. There had been more than a decade of conservative prime ministers every year looking for things to cut in the budget. Mm-hmm. Unless you presume that all of the people who have previously attempted to do this are unfathomably corrupt or incompetent, why would you think there's an enormous amount of low-hanging fruit that's just there for you to grab?
Right.
There are reasons politically why so many people have tried in various ways to make further cuts and have run up against certain limits in the federal budget. At a certain point, you're going to have to do something unpopular if you want further cuts. And then the only way that you can do that is to omnibus it with other stuff that's more popular. And that's where the big, beautiful bill becomes the strategy for getting the Medicaid cuts through. It becomes the strategy for getting all of these things through. You throw all of the stuff, including the things people like, you hope that they'll pay attention to the stuff that benefits them and ignore the stuff that hurts other people. Mm-hmm. And that will allow you to make cuts that would be considered painful if they were discussed on their own. If we just had a Medicaid work requirement bill, on its own, you could probably kill that bill pretty easily on the basis of what it does.
Mm-hmm. So what would the consequence be, or what will the consequence be of not actually reaching the 800 billion target over the next 10 years? What is it necessary to actually make these kinds of cuts? Or is everyone at least considering the possibility that you make a gesture at finding ways to cut spending or raise taxes, but without actually doing it and just kicking the can down the road to the next budget crisis? What would the political consequences and social consequences be of not addressing the issue ultimately?
Well, I think if you continue to have a very debt-heavy posture, that's going to make it harder to engage in the positive investment that is necessary to support reshoring or the generation of large, new, technologically sophisticated industries.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the trouble is that a certain amount of positive fiscal spending is necessary to be able to create the conditions for high-tech, expensive industry to operate in this country. You have to build stuff. You have to create the necessary infrastructure to support that stuff. The infrastructure spending that the Biden administration did was so incomplete from the point of view of this. They struggled even to allocate the money necessary to repair American infrastructure and maintain what we have, much less to create the conditions under which a lot of new high-tech stuff can be quickly and reliably built. This is, of course, leading into stuff like this abundance language from the Democrats, who want to position themselves as championing the positive spending side of it. Mm-hmm. But then they don't have any kind of tax plan that would support that spending. So there is a difficulty politically in generating a sufficient amount of political will to support the generation of industry in the United States on the scale that would be required to achieve the objectives that they have, which is in part why I think while there will be some movement of stuff that's immediately relevant to national defense back to the United States, because there will simply be bans on making it abroad or importing it abroad, bans or tariffs of such a scale that it will become impossible to make that stuff abroad. Most of the economy is going to continue to be very consumer driven and very debt heavy.
Mm-hmm. So if you did raise taxes to meet the needs, would that, do you think, conceivably make it more difficult to grow as well and disincentivize the capital side of production and growth? And so that, the increased taxation rate would basically be taxing fewer people or making less money that way.
Yeah, there's a limit to what you can do just with domestic U.S. policy. Ultimately, their strategy will not be successful unless they get other countries around the world to cooperate with and facilitate it. And that's why without the trade deals being real and substantive and transformative in character, and there are real questions, I think, about whether they're going to get deals of that kind. I think that a lot of countries are looking at what are other countries doing, waiting and seeing. They're not necessarily trying to jump ahead and cut a deal immediately that would facilitate some kind of large-scale shift. Countries like Indonesia have a policy of trying to stay friendly with both the United States and China at once. They are not looking to sign a deal with the United States that would facilitate a large influx of jobs or investment from China to Indonesia because they're worried about the consequences with the relationship with China if they do that. Mm-hmm. Some might say that they're hesitating or vacillating and that that's a mistake on their part. Nevertheless, a lot of countries are trying to have it both ways and are not committing straightforwardly and making the kind of deal that would facilitate very rapidly a change. And I think that the bilateral strategy is likely to produce that kind of outcome, because with the bilateral strategy, every country is concerned that its bilateral deal might be disadvantageous relative to the bilateral deals that are being negotiated with other partners. There's no common framework, no set of rules that cuts across all of the states, nothing like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a kind of common agreement, a set of rules that all of the states are following.
Mm-hmm.
And so this bilateral approach, I think, while it is more disruptive, it's able to cause more disruption in the market, which can then force adjustment. It's limited in terms of the quality of the agreements it's able to produce.
Right. And so this is a good segue. And I know we're kind of running out of time, but I want to spend a little bit of time on the other topic, which is the wars. I mean, there's like I had a conversation with Ben Burgess yesterday, and I said, there are many ways in which I don't want the Trump administration to succeed. That I directly oppose their aims, but there are a few ways in which I do want them to succeed, not from the point of view of socialism per se, but just from the point of view of not wanting the world to get considerably worse, in a conservative way. Like, I would rather the wars stop. And he seems to have wanted to end both the war in Palestine and Israel and the war in Ukraine. I would like to see some sort of new trade agreement be put together so that there's a somewhat more stability in the world. And again, I think my thinking was so that we could avoid these hot conflicts that I feel like when trade agreements don't work out, when diplomacy doesn't work out, then that's when you get wars. And so if you could rearrange these agreements, then you might end up not having to go to war with China, say, or not having to, not seemingly having to go to continue the war in Russia and so forth. But nonetheless, it seems to me, especially in Russia, that the war, and really in Gaza and in Russia, the war has its own logic. The institutions that are perpetuating the war have their own logic and power, and that there's not that much that the civilian authority, maybe mainly the president, but even the Congress, could really do to stop the continuation of the war in the short term, meaning like within the next year or two. That you look at the drone attacks in Russia that had been planned for a year and a half before they occurred, according to Zelensky, and you realize, okay, there is a limit to how quickly you can put on the brakes here. And so I'm just wondering, like, how do we understand the failure of Trump's diplomacy in this moment? And align with the trade. Yeah.
There are real reasons that these fights are happening. They're not just happening because people are unreasonable or people are crazy.
No, right.
There's actual causes to these conflicts that have to be dealt with or resolved. And if you go into it with somebody is the cause and they're bad and they have to stop, that's not going to work. And if you sit the parties down and have them have a discussion, what will often be revealed is the reason why they don't get along to the point at which they are fighting. What it is that they aren't able to agree on, that each of them would rather fight than concede on. And Trump can have a phone call with Vladimir Putin and try to talk it out with him, but ultimately Vladimir Putin's terms for ending the war are terms that Donald Trump is not accepting. So once you're at a stage where the terms somebody has are terms that you won't accept, then you're part of it because you are continuing to fight rather than accept the terms. You are participatory in the logic. I wouldn't say that Trump is trying to end the war, but there's an entrenched bureaucracy or administrative state or whatever that's in his way. There is a reason that when Vladimir Putin says, here's what I would need to stop, Trump goes, I'm not willing to accept that.
Right.
And by the same token, you can say, okay, we could get Israel out of Gaza if there was some other force in the region that could provide security there that's considered trustworthy. But no state wants to do that. And then we could try to pay a state like Egypt a godfather sum to do it, but we're not willing to pay that kind of money to Egypt. We're not willing to give Egypt enough to make it worth Egypt's while to deal with all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain fundamental limits in the negotiations.
What are they
from what the parties are not willing to agree to?
What are they in Ukraine, and what are they in Russia? The fundamentals.
Well, Putin wants a demilitarized Ukraine, and he wants to keep the territory that he's got. So he wants to grab the territory, and he doesn't want any Western weapons in Ukraine. That combination, both of those things at the same time, that's too much. It's not reasonable for a state to have a chunk of its territory grabbed and to then accept not being able to defend its remaining territory. You could imagine a situation where Ukraine could agree to being demilitarized in exchange for the return of the land. And you could imagine a situation where Ukraine concedes some of the territory, but is heavily defended by European troops. But a situation where Ukraine both gives up the land and becomes a DMZ, that's something that not only will the Ukrainians not accept that, the European partners won't accept it.
Right. And that's much more consequential. The United States and European partners won't accept it, is the key, because obviously Ukraine on its own isn't going to be able to stop the demilitarization of its territory without U.S. and NATO support. And if NATO and the United States would be willing to concede that territory to Russia, then Ukraine couldn't do much to stop it. But they are not willing to concede that. So ultimately, the difficulty is that is on the both Russia and NATO and U.S. side. And what I guess I was suggesting before was that the United States, Trump seems to be willing. Now, he hasn't said he's willing to concede on the level of demilitarization, but when he says to NATO, we're going to stop militarizing Ukraine, we're not going to be providing the support for this conflict. He hasn't done it, right? But he said it. That
he wants them to step up.
Right. Right.
Which is part of the trade negotiation, because if they increase military spending and they import weapons from the United States, then that will also have a trade effect.
Right. But the thing is, if NATO really does step up, and they haven't fully yet, but there are aspects to this, which, again, like the drone attack, I think was probably not organized through the United States, at least not in its later stages, according to
of course it will be claimed that the United States didn't have anything to do with it, just like it's claimed that the United States didn't have anything to do with Nord Stream 2. That Ukrainian agency is a great cover for things the United States doesn't want to be publicly associated with.
But I'm just granting for the moment that out of the fallout from this call for NATO to pick up more of the burden might also include being more responsible for and informed about this drone attack. I'm just going to speculate that could be the case, and that would be an explanation for Trump and his administration claiming not to have been informed. But the thing is, that's a natural consequence of telling NATO to pick up the slack and to take up the burden of militarizing Ukraine. So
even if they weren't informed, they created an environment where Ukraine felt that it could do that and it would be fine. And they're not punishing Ukraine for having done it.
No. Right. They haven't cut off weapons. So the commitments that are already in place.
They're not treating Ukraine like it's making rogue, undisciplined attacks that threaten to escalate. They're not treating Ukraine that way. They don't believe that.
Right. So my question then is there, what do you think about the necessity for NATO and the United States to maintain a military presence in Ukraine. Why has that become something that seems to warrant the risk of, I'm going to say, nuclear conflict in the region? Why is that not something they're willing to bend on?
Well, I think for one, they don't think that there is going to be nuclear conflict. I think if they really thought that there was going to be nuclear conflict, they would be behaving very differently. I don't think they even act as if there's any sizable chance of nuclear conflict. They can't possibly believe that there's a sizable chance of it. So whatever information they have regarding internal Russian communications has them fairly
there have been reports
there's not going to be nuclear conflict.
There have been reports that aspects of the state claimed that at certain points before Trump took office, there was a 50% chance of a nuclear.
See, a number like that is completely picked out of thin air. What would it even mean for there to be a percentage chance of a nuclear exchange? What would that even map onto in reality?
I guess it had to do with Putin's laying out a policy for what it would take for Russia to use its nuclear arms, maybe on the level of a small tactical nuke, to defend its territory based on. So they're estimating the likelihood that Putin will fall through on his stated policies.
See, they pay way too much attention to what people say and not enough to what people actually do. And this is the problem with so much of the coverage of all of the events of the world today, is the focus on what people say and not on what they do. There have been incredible escalations that have gotten such a muted response from Russia. This clearly indicates a lack of willingness on the part of Russia to escalate. Russia has been titted, and it's not tatting anything like as hard as it would need to be tatting to indicate that it's able and willing to seriously contemplate nuclear use. They talk, but then when there is an attack on Russian territory, in this case, an attack on Russian long-range bombers, the response from Russia is still, they're not even trying to engage in a total war of destruction against the cities of Ukraine. They're not escalating a kind of they're not engaging in indiscriminate destruction of cities. They're not acting like they're in a total war. They're not acting like they're in a war of fighting for the survival of the regime. They clearly are not willing to treat it like that.
Right. Why not, do you think? Because it just isn't a existential threat in reality, or?
They don't need to. There isn't any immediate risk of the government collapsing or civil war occurring. The economy of Russia, while of course it has taken a hit from all of this, is functional enough. It's not as if Russian society is collapsing or falling apart. So there isn't an existential situation that would make nuclear use even begin to seem like a reasonable thing to do. The attack on the long-range bombers does not create that situation. It's not an attempt by the United States to destroy the Russian state, produce civil war. There's language about that. You can find some Americans and some people associated with American foreign policy who say they'd like to see something like that happen. Just like you can find people in Russia who say that they would like to potentially use a tactical nuke or escalate to the nuclear level. But in point of fact, the sides both have a shared understanding of the limited character of the conflict. Yeah. If there was an attempt to, invade Russian territory with NATO and to take Moscow and destroy the Russian state, this is what nuclear weapons are for. They're for situations where you're losing something like a world war at the conventional level, and you've become panicked. And even though nuclear use is unlikely to help you, because all it will do is make the whole situation worse for everybody involved, you reach a point of desperation where you feel like it's your only possible way of getting the other side to potentially stop. So out of desperation and sheer, I don't know what else I can do, you resort to nuclear use. It's not something that people do willy-nilly. And part of the consequence of the nuclear era is that we tend to fight these wars that are limited, where the sides recognize the war is limited from the beginning and while there's always chatter about it, because if you can use language about it to convince somebody not to do something, why wouldn't you? The actual use would just completely create a completely devastating situation. And everybody understands that. It's a chaotic situation and you don't know what emerges from it. It's totally uncontrollable once you unleash that. So you would only do it if you were in a very, very bad situation and you were attempting a kind of Hail Mary. We are not putting the Russians in that situation. We are escalating it well beyond what we would have done in the Cold War. In part because in the Cold War, there seemed to be more widespread belief that the weapons would in fact be used. But after the end of history, there's a closing up of how seriously people are willing to take these kinds of fights. A war that occurs after the fall of the Soviet Union doesn't seem to people to have the same stakes as a war that occurred even in the 60s and 70s. So the possibility of nuclear use seems to be more removed now.
Yeah, my feeling about that has always been, and we should move on because I'm supposed to be running the Zoom call already. But my feeling has been that feeling that things are more constrained, that the risk is lower, actually is a factor in increasing the risk, that we might be more at risk today because we presume that these things couldn't end up being used than we were when it seemed like a more live option, when mutual assured destruction was actually a real policy. And so I don't want to say that is any kind of refutation of what you just said. It just is that I feel as though there's a danger here that needs to be thoroughly addressed, but I can't start by just ignoring the logic you put forward. That does seem to be the way, not just like people, but people in power are thinking, and that would include Putin and Trump. And
every day Putin doesn't use those nuclear weapons. It's in a situation where in the 60s, it would have been assumed that they would have been used. And every day that goes by that he doesn't use them further undermines any belief that he would ever use them. He's already allowed, the long-range bombers to be struck. He's allowed territory inside Russia to be struck by NATO weapons. He's allowed all of these things over and over and over again. He's allowed them without even using a tactical nuclear weapon.
Right. Right. And yeah, so in the 60s, of course, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, so it's hard to make a direct comparison because
but even
already
in the territory of the Russian Federation, there have been strikes. There's been an invasion of the territory of the Russian Federation. They moved Ukrainian troops and forces into Russian territory.
No,
and
I know.
Set up a defensive position.
I'm just saying because the enemy is different.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem as necessary because it's not the free world against the dark forces behind the Iron Curtain. It shows you how diminished Russia is as a superpower. That this can occur, and it can occur basically within what was its own territory. A war between what had been part of the Soviet Union on another part of what had been the Soviet Union. It's just not the same situation.
Ultimately, Putin still wants to make a deal.
Right.
It's just his terms are unacceptable to the West. And that's been the truth of the Putin government for the last 25 years. He has wanted various kinds of economic arrangements with the West that the West is not willing to make with him. He wants a growth trajectory for Russia that the West has not been able or willing to grant to him. And this is an attempt to try to play leverage for a deal. Conflicts between the Soviet Union and the United States were not of that character.
That is right. All right, listen, we'll wrap it up here, and I'll go right to the Zoom call. People who are watching can join us there. Sorry about the technical difficulties and the late start. Thank you, Benjamin, for this conversation. I was attempting to play the devil's advocate all the way through, and you held up your side of the bargain admirably. I still do worry reflexively about the possibility of nuclear war. I don't think that my Gen X brain will ever quite accept that we're not still in the Cold War in some base kind of lizard brain way. But we're not. And I'll see everybody in the Zoom call in about 2 minutes.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential